This is the Science Hour from the BBC World Service. Now, you may think wind is wind, but in many parts of the world, we give particular wind patterns sort of affectionate names.
The Mistral, that happens in the Rhone Valley, down into the Mediterranean. We've got a strange one called the Willawar, which happens in Alaska. A Chinook wind, which is caused by the Rocky Mountains, and the Zonda, which happens again, is caused by the Andes.
In Crowd Science, in half an hour, Marnie Chesterton breezes through all kinds of wind science. Before that, on Science in Action, while there's been great excitement about the vaccines that do seem to work against COVID-19, we want to know for how long.
I would love to say that I looked in my crystal ball this morning and I know that the memory lasts exactly 12 years, 3 months, 5 days and 33 seconds.
Post-natural infection, immunity does seem to last a long time, as you can hear on Science in Action coming up.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The United States has now exceeded 12 million cases of the coronavirus since the pandemic began. The world's worst affected country is experiencing a surge in the virus, setting records each day for the number of new infections. President Trump is reported to have missed an online session at the G20 summit on pandemic preparedness and was pictured a short time later on his golf course. More details from Lebu de Seco in Washington.
We had a very interesting statement from the White House, quite carefully worded, saying that Donald Trump participated in the first day of the Virtual Leaders Summit and that he discussed with other world leaders the need to work together. But they didn't say that he attended that session, and it came after US media had shown pictures of him on the golf course, and I think perhaps it was an attempt to try and put a lid on those or stop that discussion.
Election officials in Wisconsin have accused Donald Trump supporters of obstructing the state's recount of presidential votes. If the recount is not concluded by the 1st of December, the way is open for the Trump campaign to pursue a lawsuit. In the state of Pennsylvania, their attempts to throw out millions of mail-in votes has been rejected, as David Willis reports.
Judge Matthew Brown said the lawsuit brought by Donald Trump's personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani contained speculative accusations that were unsupported by evidence. His verdict clears the way for Pennsylvania officials to certify the election result there in the next few days. Mr. Trump's Democratic rival Joe Biden won the state by more than 80,000 votes. Another key swing state, Michigan, is also due to certify its election result on Monday.
Hundreds of anti-government protesters in Guatemala have vandalised and set fire to parts of the Congress building before being dispersed by riot police. Elsewhere in the capital, Guatemala City, there were largely peaceful demonstrations against the newly approved budget. The opposition says it prioritises big infrastructure projects over Guatemalans suffering the social and economic consequences of COVID-19. The shipping company Viking Line has said some 400 people will spend the night on board a ferry that's run aground off the Finnish Åland Islands in the Baltic Sea. Divers confirmed that there were no leaks in the hull of the Viking Grace. With the latest for us, here's Grant Ferret.
Mobile phone footage shows the Viking Grace ferry looming over a rocky, wooded shoreline close to the port of Mariehamn. Local residents said the vessel was so close to land they could virtually touch it. The cause of the grounding is unclear, but the weather was poor with high winds and choppy waters. It's the second time one of the firm's ferries has run aground in the Baltic since September.
This is Chris Barrow with the latest world news from the BBC. The burial has taken place of a black man who was brutally killed by 2 white security guards in southern Brazil earlier this week. João Alberto Silveira Freitas, a 40-year-old welder and community leader, was severely beaten in the city of Porto Alegre. The attack was filmed by witnesses. President Jair Bolsonaro has dismissed the racial aspect of the incident. The North African wing of Al-Qaeda, Akim, has named a new leader following the killing in June of its previous head, Abdel Malik Droukdal, in a French military operation in Mali. An audio message published online by the group names the Algerian militant Abu Ubaida Yusuf al-Anabi as his successor. Pope Francis has urged young entrepreneurs and economists to take up the challenge of creating a new, more just economic model that protects the planet while also helping the poor and dispossessed. In a video address to more than 2,000 young Roman Catholics, the pontiff told them they were called upon to make a concrete impact in their communities. He warned against a return to feverish consumerism. The world's top two men's tennis players have been knocked out of the ATP finals in London. Daniil Medvedev beat Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic was defeated by Dominic Thiem at the O2 Arena. It was Medvedev's first win over Rafael Nadal, and he'll face Thiem in the final on Sunday. With the latest, here's Russell Fuller.
This match always seemed likely to stretch to 3 sets, especially when Medvedev had a point for a 5-1 lead in the second. But Nadal fought back spectacularly and served for the match, only to be broken to love and forced into a tiebreak, which Medvedev won 7-4. The 6'6" Russian was the one making the running in the decider. He broke for 4-3 and then again to close out the match as Nadal tired visibly. Medvedev did not win a single match on his debut last year. He's won all 4 he's played 12 months on.
BBC News.
Welcome to Science in Action from the BBC World Service with me, Roland Pease. We heard this week that recorded COVID cases in Africa just reached 2 million. It sounds a lot, but it's well below international infection rates, though maybe that's because they're not all being recorded.
We really don't have corona because they were expecting people to drop dead. This enabled people to realize that the disease is here with us and it spread a lot farther than we can actually be able to define or describe.
New data from Kenya may give a better idea of the true extent of COVID-19. But we're also looking at the mosquito that spread over centuries across the world from northern Africa with fearsome abilities to carry disease.
Because the invasive form is so well adapted to the human environment, so it feeds and breeds off the human environment, it wasn't established that they had a difference in their ability to carry the virus.
An unexpected adaptation. And we'll also be looking for a solution that fairly shares the water of the Blue Nile between Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia. That's coming up. With well over 500,000 new cases every day and 10,000 deaths daily due to COVID-19, the pandemic gets worse and worse. The gloom has been offset, though, by fantastically encouraging results from the Pfizer, Moderna and Oxford vaccine trials. They're trickling out. But commentators have been careful to point out that short-term protection from SARS-CoV-2 doesn't necessarily translate into long-term protection, and we keep hearing stories that antibodies to the virus dwindle fast after natural infection. But there is more to immunity than just antibodies, and it's timely that an in-depth study came out this week analysing blood samples of nearly 200 patients up to 8 months after they were infected. It was led by 2 immunologists who were on Science in Action not long ago, Alessandro Setti and Daniela Weisskopf.
The majority of people look at antibodies because this is the easiest accessible specimen from people you can get. You can get small blood draws, you look at the plasma of these people, and you can detect antibodies. A next step is look at the cellular component of the immune system. So for this, you need to get larger amounts of blood and isolate the white blood cells and then keep them alive. So this study is unique in that sense that this actually looked at all the components of the immune system. So we looked at antibodies, B cells, T cells, and in the T cells, CD4 and CD8 T cells, and also in the neutralizing capacity of antibodies. It's one of the first times that all of these arms have been looked at in the same samples over time.
And what's the longest record that you have from those patients?
I think the longest out sample we have been collecting was 8 months after onset of symptoms, yes.
8 months. This is quite different from just a few weeks afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. And the time point is really dictated by how this pandemic unfolded, because this is as far as you can go. You cannot study anyone 12 months after infection right now. So we've been following these patients in real time, basically.
And Alessandro, because it is so complicated, could you just take us through those different components of the immune system?
Oh, yeah. So the different component of the immune system, as the antibodies that are secreted by B cells bind to the virus and neutralize it, and therefore are very important for preventing the infection. The T cells, the killer T cells, are very important for terminating and controlling an infection, because once the virus is inside the cell, it's invisible to the antibodies. And the killer T cells instead recognize infected cells, because infected cells shred pieces that end up being displayed on the surface of the infected cell. And the killer T cells are keen to recognize that and kill the infected cell. Finally, the helper T cells, as the name says, are very helpful, and they orchestrate the response. Without helper T cells, you typically do not have a good neutralizing response at the level of antibodies. The response is weak and is not long-lasting.
It's one thing for the immunity of people who've recovered from the coronavirus infection, but now we've got these first results in from some of these mRNA vaccines. The Oxford group have got some results about what their vaccine is doing. As someone who studies immune response, are you seeing really important aspects to this long-term memory that maybe they're somehow, they're ticking the right boxes?
Yes, I think we can be really thinking positive about this. From our early studies on studying the immune response after a couple of weeks to months after infection, we already saw good news that, first of all arms of the immune system recognize this virus, the T cells, the B cells, the antibodies. We could also show already back then that the parts of the virus that are really well recognized by the immune system are also the ones that are in the majority of vaccine constructs. So that was good news too. Now that we are 6+ months after the infection, start of the infection of many of these samples here in the West Coast, we do still see the exact same thing than we saw in our first study a couple months after infection.
The fact that they're seeing far fewer people becoming symptomatic in these vaccine trials might just mean that they've got a good antibody response, but not necessarily a good T cell one and a B cell one that might have long-term memories. And you're saying you can't see anything in the data at this stage that would tell you about those long-term effects?
To see long-term effect, you need to have a long-term study. I would love to say that I looked in my crystal ball this morning and I know that the memory lasts exactly 12 years, 3 months, 5 days, and 33 seconds. The point is that that time has not elapsed. So we, in terms of experimental data, we are bound to what observations we have. On the other hand, from everything else we know, this situation behaves like any other situation we've seen. There is no reason to suspect that this is going to be a short-lived immunity. There was a reason to suspect back then. So when Daniela Shincrodi and I published a first Cell paper, we were looking at early after infection. And we said, this is good news. It looks like there is a very decent immune response. We had to wait 6 months to see if this response was long-lasting. And sure enough, it was long-lasting because it looked like a good response. Now we are in the same shoes with vaccines. We see a good response, we see good protection. Is it going to last? Who knows? But there is no reason to say that it wouldn't.
Okay, so I'm impatient for quick results, but I do appreciate the measured optimism of Alessandro Setti and Daniela Weisskopf. Taking a short break there from their intensive studies at the La Jolla Institute in California. Their mammoth paper, we could only really scrape the surface, was posted this week on the bioRxiv preprint site, which I've often spoken about. When it comes to tracking COVID-19, long-lived immune markers like antibodies do have an advantage of giving a biological record that someone has been infected, even if it wasn't noticed at the time. In Kenya, as in many parts of the world, the PCR tests for current infection have been reserved for those showing symptoms or their direct contacts, so that the spread of SARS-CoV-2 is probably very underestimated. Sophie Uyoga and colleagues at the KEMRI Wellcome Research Programme got access to thousands of samples from Kenya's blood banks up until mid-June to see what the antibodies would reveal about the true state of the country's epidemic.
1 in 25 individuals within that age group of 15 to 65 years had exposure to SARS-CoV-2. Essentially, we're talking about 4.3%. So by the time we were conducting this study, we had about only 2,093 cases that had been detected. And if you extrapolate it within the age bands that we worked within, so this means about 1.3 million people in that age group had already seen this exposure vis-a-vis the 2,093 cases that had been detected by the Ministry of Health.
So a much larger percentage of people than the PCR tests were showing. So those numbers are very comparable to what other parts of the world, Europe and America, would have been reporting back at that time.
They are.
And does it sort of match the death rate? Does that make more sense, that you're seeing basically the same number of people dying per number, 100 cases of infection?
Our death rate is quite low. We just hit the 1,000 mark quite recently. I think by yesterday we had about 1,200 deaths reported since the start of the pandemic. So we are definitely getting a lot more asymptomatic cases. About 90% of the cases from the active surveillance are asymptomatic. We generally have a lesser severe form of the disease being prevalent in our population.
And is that because of the age structure of the population of Kenya?
It could be because of the age structure, because our population is generally a lot younger compared to the European population. But some people are also saying it could be we really need to look at the genetics of the African population and compare to the European population, the people who actually get to succumb to severe disease and those who present with the symptomatic disease. Are there any differences in our genetic background that maybe give us, quote-unquote, protection from getting severe disease?
How representative are the blood donors that you're sampling relative to the whole population of Kenya?
We are using samples from blood donors who are generally between the age of 15 and 65 in our population. And this is just only about 53% of the Kenyan population. So we still have that 47% that is missing. And then also, unfortunately, currently heavily relying on family replacement donors.
Family, you better explain that.
These are family members who come and donate blood. Our blood bank is facing some financial challenges. So essentially, which also coupled by the closure of schools who are the main donor population. So due to the blood shortages, then when you have an admission, you have to look for your relatives to come and donate blood in order for you to receive a transfusion. So we are calling them family replacement donors as opposed to voluntary, non-remunerated blood donors who are what is recommended.
I'm wondering whether in terms of public health, protecting people's lives, preventing the spread of the disease, are there lessons, do you think, from what you're seeing?
Contrary to what people thought that we really don't have corona because they were expecting people to drop dead. This enabled people to realize that the disease is here with us and it's spread a lot farther than we can actually be able to define or describe. So it was actually a shocking headline on our local newspapers that millions of Kenyans are actually exposed or infected. It enabled people to visualize and to accept the fact that the pandemic is ongoing and we do have a lot more asymptomatic infections and people are actually able to get infected and maybe even recover without their knowledge. So it was eye-opening.
Sophie Oyoga on a line from Mombasa. Her study was just published by Science, which is where you can also find some surprising new insights into the disease-transmitting mosquito Aedes aegypti, which is not only adapted to living close to humans and to biting humans, we talked about that only a few weeks ago, but to carrying live Zika virus in its gut. The story starts with a detail I've not properly grasped, that there are two distinct subspecies of the mosquito. The original form that's still found in sub-Saharan Africa and the more fearsome variant that has spread worldwide from North Africa. Entomologist Louis Lambrecht picks up the story.
It turned out that for Zika virus, at least, mosquitoes in Africa are much more resistant to infection. When they feed on a human host that's infected, then they're less likely to become infected themselves and then less likely to transmit it, to pass it on to somebody else.
I mean, how do you even establish that?
Well, the way we measure susceptibility to a virus infection in mosquitoes is to essentially expose them to mixture of blood and virus in lab conditions. We make a mixture of human red blood cells and virus that we grow in cell culture, and we offer that infectious blood meal through an artificial system, which consists of a small device that maintains the blood mixture at the right temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. And the mosquitoes can imbibe that blood meal by biting through a membrane, which in our case is pig intestine, sausage casings, essentially. And so they feed on that artificial infectious blood meal, and then a few days later, we check whether they acquired the infection or not. We also like to kind of confirm it in a more natural situation, and in the particular study we're discussing today, we did check the results in a more realistic model. In this case, it was a mouse model of Zika virus infection. So we allowed the mosquitoes to feed on Zika virus infected mice to verify that indeed the African subspecies was less able to acquire the virus infection when it fed on a live host, not just this artificial mixture.
This presumably goes some way to explain why, when Zika emerged big time, it was in Brazil and other parts of the world and not in Africa, because I think it is actually a virus from Africa itself.
Yeah, that's right. So Zika virus was first isolated from a sentinel monkey in Uganda in 1947. However, there has been no major human outbreak in Africa so far, despite the explosive emergence of Zika virus through the Pacific Islands and Latin America in the last few years. There hasn't been any single large human outbreak in Africa, with the exception of Cape Verde, where there was an outbreak in 2017. Cape Verde is off the coast of Senegal, so it's technically Africa, but we don't know whether the mosquitoes there are really true African mosquitoes, and we suspect there might be actually hybrids between the two subspecies. We don't know that yet, and we're working on it. But my point is that it was a big mystery why in Africa, despite the presence of the virus for decades, there wasn't any epidemic, but at least we know the mosquitoes there are less capable of carrying the virus, so that makes an epidemic much less likely.
And is this kind of specialization, should we say, for the Zika virus, is that, do you see the same thing with other viruses, chikungunya or yellow fever virus? Is there something more general about this?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because Zika virus belongs to a family of viruses called flaviviruses that also contains several other medically relevant viruses like dengue viruses or yellow fever virus or West Nile virus. We wondered whether the striking difference in susceptibility to Zika virus that we saw between the African subspecies and the invasive subspecies of Aedes aegypti extended to other flaviviruses. So we did a few experiments in this direction, and we tested one strain of each of the 4 dengue types and one strain of yellow fever virus. And in all cases, we found the same pattern where the African mosquitoes were more resistant to virus infection than the invasive subspecies. However, I want to be very cautious about that, because we need to test many more strains to make a firm conclusion. At this stage, it looks like it might be a general phenomenon across flaviviruses, but there might be more specific interactions if we were to test more strains of each of these viruses.
Louis Lambrecht of the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And if you go online, the extended version of the interview there delves into the evolutionary roots of our troubles with this mosquito. And we're staying in North Africa, and on the Nile, in fact, for this last item. Fed by twin sources in Ethiopia, the Blue Nile, and in the Great Lakes of East Africa, the White Nile, the river has sustained the lower reaches since the time of the pharaohs. Before that too, I'm sure. And since 1970, the High Aswan Dam near the border with Sudan has given farmers a regulated supply of fresh water while also generating gigawatts of electricity. But Ethiopia is now close to completing a huge dam across the Blue Nile. Indeed, they started holding back some water just this summer. And as yet, there's no agreement on how the different countries can cooperate over the tributary's precious water, particularly during the initial filling stage. Egyptian-born hydrologist Hissam El-Dadiri has been working on a solution for his PhD at the University of Washington, Seattle.
It's expected to be the largest hydropower dam in Africa. It has a storage of about 74 kilometer cube which, I mean, just to put this number into context, the amount of water that's coming from the Blue Nile is around 47 to 50 kilometer cube. So you have to imagine that the volume that can be stored by this dam is even greater than the amount that's coming every year from the Blue Nile. So if it's compared to the Grand Coulee Dam, which is the largest hydropower dam here in the US, it's about 6 times. It's very big, yeah.
And the important point is that the Blue Nile is the major source of water in Egypt, and in particular the major flow of water that keeps the Aswan Dam, the High Aswan Dam, going.
Yeah, that's true. The GERD, or I mean, when I say GERD, it's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it will be controlling the Blue Nile, which contributes to most of the flow that's coming down to Sudan and Egypt. You know, the Nile River Basin has 2 sources, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And the Blue Nile is the major, or the main river that's giving the flow down to Egypt. In terms of percentage, I mean, the White Nile only contributes to about 14%. 86% is coming, the water is coming from the Blue Nile. That's for sure it'll impact the water that's coming to Egypt.
I mean, is there no agreement at the moment between the governments? Is this the problem?
They are still negotiating. They have asked the US to intervene into the situation and try to help into the negotiation. They also, the African Union is involved also in the situation, but they haven't reached an agreement about to cooperate in the sharing the water in the Nile River. When they negotiate for an agreement, they have to find the number of filling years that will have a less impacts on the downstream, but at the same time, they're making sure that Ethiopia is getting the benefit from the dam in terms of the hydropower production.
I mean, what sort of schedule would that look like?
Based on the analysis we did in the paper, the 3-year, which is a very fast approach of filling the dam, that will have significant impact on the water reaching downstream in Egypt. The percentage of reduction is about 80% for the water that will be reaching Egypt in case of 3-year filling scenarios. And what we recommend is filling the dam in 5 years or more. This will have a less impacts on the downstream. And even Egypt, if they are going to take some actions in terms of the irrigation practice in the downstream, this will be very helpful and will have a less impact on the downstream water use.
And once Ethiopians are past this filling stage that you're talking about, the situation will return more to some kind of steady state. Will there be net benefits downstream because of the regulation of the net flow down the Nile, or will there be some kind of permanent losses and the countries downstream will be always at a loss relative to where they are now?
It will take some time until the post-filling phase become stable. What I found in my research that the High Aswan Dam, during the filling stage, the storage level will go down. To give an example, in case of the 3-year filling of the dam, the High Aswan Dam storage level can go down. It's a low level, like 150 or something, which is very close to the lowest operating level of the dam. And in that case, after the filling for the High Aswan Dam to return back to its normal operation, it will take more years. And based on my analysis, it might take up to 20 years or more, again, based on the variability of the rainfall in Ethiopia. But later, after High Aswan Dam return back to its normal operation, the Ethiopian dam will be regulating the flow in the Blue Nile. And I think as Egypt is adapting the High Aswan Dam operation, it might have a less impacts on Egypt.
Issam El-Dadiri, whose proposal was just published in the Journal of Hydrology. Some kind of agreement and adaptation really is essential. And that is it for Science in Action this week. And from me, Roland Pease, and producer Julian Siddle, there are highlights and whole editions on our webpage at bbcworldservice.com. But if you stay listening to the Science Hour after the break, you'll be blown away by Crowdscience's Force 10 investigations of wind.
This is the BBC World Service.